Good morning, Honors English. So I have a couple of things to tell you about our fairy tale unit. This is due on May 25th, so it's the last thing you'll submit for me. This particular unit has a bunch of what I call DBIs, or document-based inquiry. It also has 3 essays. So, to backtrack a bit, okay, what is a fairy tale? That is the question, right? It is. I put a PowerPoint there on what is a fairy tale, which you may watch if you would like to. But it's not going to let me do it. Oh, rude. Okay. I'm fighting with my computer because obviously that's how things work. Okay, here we go. So basically, a fairy tale is defined in 2 ways. It's either a story for children about fairies or a story about magic and enchantment, or it's an improbable story or a lie, which is, okay. Now, there is a timeline for fairy tales. Fairy tales are fascinating because they actually start pretty early on in human history. The first fairy tale that we think of as a fairy tale was written in AD 100 to 200, and it's the myth of Cupid and Psyche. It's very, very similar to Beauty and the Beast, and East of the Sun, West of the Moon. It's like the 2 fairy tales had a baby, and that's Cupid and Psyche. Then you have in the year 200 to 300, a Hindu collection of tales was written, and they are actually considered to be the forerunners of some of the European fairy tales that we know and love. Then in 1850 to 1860, the very first fairy tale, the very first Cinderella, was written down in China. Right, that's the one with the fairy godfish that I mentioned in class, just in case I didn't, where the Cinderella has a fairy godfish that's her fish friend, and then her stepmother kills the fish, and Cinderella accidentally eats the fish, and then she has the bones, and she's followed around by the ghost fish. Okay. And then you have, in 1300, a Latin work called Gesta Romanorum is produced. It's basically a collection of tales and short stories that they think influenced Shakespeare and Edmund Spenser, who wrote The Fairy Queen. And then in 1500, 1001 Arabian Nights is first recorded, which is awesome. We're going to put a pin in that. We're going to come back to 1001 Arabian Nights. Okay. And then in France, in the 1690 to 1710 range, the French salons, there's a lot of women writers who are getting together, and they are writing fairy tales. Marie Catherine Delaunay is one of the most famous, and she actually published 4 volumes of fairy tales that were translated and published in English in the 1690s. And then in 1697, we get this dude named Charles Perrault, who wrote a series of books called the Mother Goose Tales. These were published in Paris, and they enjoyed instant success. These stories, you might be familiar, they include Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, Little Red Riding Hood, Bluebeard, and Puss in Boots, which is about a cat who wears boots. Then in 1815 in Germany, we get Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, who publish the Grimm Brothers fairy tales. Basically, they went around Germany and collected a bunch of stories because Germany was being conquered by everybody at the time. So they went around and collected stories from all the different pieces of Germany and put them together, and were like, hey, look, we have a national identity. This is our fairy tales. So that's kind of cool. 1889 in England, Andrew Lang publishes the first of his 12 fairy books, the Blue Fairy Book. It's basically numerous sources, multicultural fairy tale collections, which is pretty cool. And then in 1890 in Russia, Tchaikovsky's Sleeping Beauty premieres in St. Petersburg. Walt Disney would eventually not steal, but borrow this music for his adaptation of the story of Sleeping Beauty. In 1893, Marion Rolfe Cox publishes her book Cinderella, 345 variants of Cinderella, Catskin, and Kappa Rushes, which puts Cinderella as the most common fairy tale or theme around the world. Basically, poor girl abused by family triumphs through kindness and hard work, becomes fabulously wealthy and wonderful. And also you'll notice that there are 345 variations of Cinderella in 1893. And that includes stories like Catskin, Donkey Skin, Kappa Rushes, that kind of stuff. So we like ourselves a rags to riches story. Then we move on. We take quite a big jump, actually, to the 1930s, where Snow White comes out by Disney. And then there's a ballet in Russia, the Ballet of Cinderella, in 1945. Then Jean Cocteau releases a film, La Belle et la Bête, Beauty and the Beast. Sorry, I can't pronounce these things. In 1946. In 1950, Disney releases Cinderella, putting their spin on the Cinderella story. 1991, Beauty and the Beast was released. First feature-length animated film to be nominated for an Academy Award, so woo! Then in 1997, we have Cinderella coming kind of back into the mainstream. Not that it ever left, but Ella Enchanted, which is a retelling of Cinderella, is published in 1997 and will eventually win a Newbery Honor. Then, in 2004, we get the Shreks. So, Shrek 2 is one of the highest grossing films of the year, and Shrek 2, I think, is better than Shrek 1 because it revisits a lot of those fairy tale themes while parodying popular culture and fairy tales in a way that I think Shrek 1 didn't quite succeed. Shrek 1 is more of a satire of the Disney company. Shrek 2 is more of a satire of fairy tales. Now, there are a couple of fairy tale conventions and stock characters, the people that always pop up in fairy tales. So you've got the wicked stepmother, the fairy godmother, the clever orphan, the curious children, the slave or servant, boy or girl, the damsel or dude in distress, and the prince or princess charming. You normally find prince or princess charming and dude in distress in like the Norwegian, Scandinavian folk tales, and some in Scotland. For some reason, I don't know. Why could that be? Now, we're going to talk about a couple of dudes here. We got Charles Perrault, who was the French author and adapter of fairy tales. He was a wealthy member of the court of King Louis, and he wrote the Mother Goose stories. His first story had 8 things in it. His best known has 8 stories in it. His best known tales are Little Red Riding Hood, Sleeping Beauty, Puss in Boots, Cinderella, and Bluebeard, which I find funny because Bluebeard is really not that well known. Also, his Cinderella story is the one that Disney gives credit. His Sleeping Beauty story, is the one Disney gives credit to. But actually, in his Sleeping Beauty story, no, I'm sorry, I've got that switched. Disney gives credit to the Grimm brothers, and they should be giving credit to Perrault. Sorry about that. Because in the Grimm version of Sleeping Beauty, she wakes up at the halfway point, the prince brings her home, and his mother's an ogre, and she tries to kill her. In the Perrault version, she wakes up, they live happily ever after, the end. So, sorry, mix those two up. Little Red Riding Hood has been adapted, when Hoodwinked. Cinderella, again, it's had so many adaptations, it's kind of ridiculous. You've got Cinderella's story, Ella Enchanted, Ever After. So, there's a lot. Now, the Grimm brothers, jumping away from the French, were born near Kassel, Germany. They're from a family of 9 children. 6 of them survived infancy. They spent a lot of time in the countryside in what they called idyllic. However, when Jacob was 11, their father died and they moved into a cramped urban setting. So they tended to idealize and excuse fathers because theirs left by accident. And so they have a predominance of female villains in their tales, mostly wicked stepmothers. Now, the Grimms were very interested in the study of ancient Germanic folklore and literature. They lived during the Napoleonic Wars and the French rule of Germany, and the brothers supported French unification. And they wanted to give Germany a shared literary and oral heritage, so they were collecting fairy tales to kind of share those with people, like, hey, look, we got these things. They published their first volume in 1812, but there was a lot of backlash because they called it children's and household tales. They were not technically regarded as suitable for children. There was a bit too much cannibalism and incest in there. So they were like, Also, they were too scholarly. They're like, first of all, too scholarly. Second of all, way too violent. Tone it down. So the Grimm brothers, their principal goal was to uncover the etymological and linguistic truths that bound the German people together. What were some shared things that all of them had in common? Because fairy tales, again, tell you about the morals of a society. So they're like, what are the shared morals that each of these tales from different parts of Germany had in common? The stories basically were life as generations of Central Europeans knew it. Often cruel. They were also not necessarily trying to tell people things, if that makes sense. They weren't necessarily trying to share these folk tales to entertain people. They were just trying to save them because they were afraid the French were going to, destroy their culture. But when they saw how much young readers liked their stories in spite of the violence, the Grimms and their editors started fixing things. Their stories got a lot sweeter, softer, and they added some morals. Now, Charles Perrault was the king of morals. His Cinderella has like a 2-page moral. It's ridiculous. The Grimm brothers are more like, here's a sentence, which I appreciate as a reader, but... So they censored tales for adults to read to children. They added more clear sequential structuring, made tales lively by adding adjectives, proverbs, and dialogue. They also made tales reflect middle-class values in a way they hadn't before, and they eliminated erotic and sexual content, to which parents everywhere said, thank you. They also added Christian expressions and references, emphasized traditional roles of men and women according to the dominant patriarchal codes of the time, and added lessons for children, even harsh ones. There are some morals in Grimm's fairy tales that are just very... wow. But it sticks. Kind of like with Pinocchio. When I was a kid, I was afraid of lying because I was afraid my nose was going to grow. Thanks for that, Disney. So that's the Grimm brothers. Oh, also, they believe that the historical knowledge, customs, mores, and laws would increase self-understanding and social enlightenment. So they were doing their part to make their society better. They would also invite storytellers to their homes and have them read stories out loud, and most of them were educated young women from the middle class or the aristocracy. And these women had been told these stories by their nurses. Some other fun Grimm facts. Between 1990 and 2002, the Grimms were actually depicted on the 1,000 mark note, the largest bit of money in the German currency. In 1962, The Wonderful World of the Brothers Grimm was a movie that showed a fictionalized account of the conflict in the brothers' lives between their work and dramatizing 3 of their tales like they were real. 2005, there was the movie The Brothers Grimm, starring Matt Damon and Heath Ledger. That movie. It's like comedy horror, but not. It's weird. It's a weird one. In their roles as the collectors in the collections of fairy tales, the Brother Grimms are actually sometimes referenced in modern adaptations of fairy tales. You've got The 10th Kingdom, where they visit the magical realm and write things down, or Ella Enchanted, where they basically make stereotypes about magical creatures and immortalize them forever. Now, interesting things about this time period that you'll notice in fairy tales that will pop up. One issue of particular concern to women of that time period was the common practice of arranged marriages, particularly among the upper classes. Women had no legal say in these arrangements. They were conducted as business transactions between one family and another. You have a son and a boat. I have a daughter and I need a boat. Daughters were used to cement alliances, to curry favor, and to settle debt, and there was no possibility of divorce. Now, young girls could find themselves married off to men many years their senior or of vile temper and habits. Disobedient daughters could be shut away in convents, nunneries, or locked up in madhouses with lobotomies. So this is kind of where stories like Beauty and the Beast come into play. Because, yeah, he's a monster now, but he'll get better. Okay, so that's kind of one of those stories that was written for a very specific purpose. Now, our next dude is Hans Christian Andersen, who was born in the slums of Denmark. His father was a poor but literate shoemaker who believed he was an aristocrat. Andersen's mother was a washerwoman and told her son about the magical land of folklore. Andersen was also bisexual. Fun fact. Andersen's fairy tales and stories were written sometime between 1835 and 1872. He wrote original stories as well as retelling stories from his childhood, and only 12 of his 156 known fairy stories drew on folklore. Basically, of the 156 stories that he wrote down, only 12 of them were based on something else, which is crazy impressive. He broke new ground in both style and content. Fairy tales at this time were didactic, and which basically means there was a black and a white. He brought them into ambiguity. Okay, so basically, in The Little Mermaid, Is she making the right choice to not kill the prince? Should she kill the prince? That's the question. There's no easy answer to the things in his fairy tales. Does the Snow Queen save Kai, or does she just doom him to a life of sadness? There's no easy answer to these things. There's good characters that are a lot more that are morally gray in Andersen's fairy tales in a way that you don't see in other ones. Children and misfits often speak truth. They serve as his mouthpieces in moral questions. Also, he's a big fan of The Ugly Duckling. He wrote that story. The ugliness of the hero or heroine often conceals great beauty, which is revealed after their misfortunes. Then there's a super creepy picture of a baby duck in the slideshow. I love it. It's worth looking through just for that. Fairy tale themes, you've got didactic, which refers to literature or other types of art that are informative or instructional. It also refers to texts that are overburdened with instructive and factual information. Sometimes my lectures can be didactic. Okay? Now, a fable, as you know, is a brief story illustrating a moral. Unlike parables, they usually include talking animals or animated objects as the principal characters. And the interactions of these animals or inanimate objects reveal truths about the human nature in a way that only talking teacups can. Motifs are a conspicuous recurring element, like an incident, device, reference, verbal formula, which appears frequently. So, in fairy tales, you've got the Cinderella motif, which is poor girl, right? Or there's some sort of incident that happens, like orphaned child, over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. A revisionism is the retelling of a story with substantial alterations in character or environment to kind of revise things. So, Ever After is a revision of Cinderella. A Cinderella story is a revision of Cinderella. The setting can be updated or altered, and the story can be told from a different point of view. So if someone wrote a fairy tale, like a Cinderella story, from the point of view of one of the stepsisters, that's a revision. Archetype, the original model or pattern from which other later copies are made. This is usually a character in action or a situation that seems to represent common patterns of human life. Archetypes include a symbol, a theme, a setting, a character, something that critics think have a common meaning. Archetypes recur in different times and places in myth, literature, folklore, fairy tales, dreams, artwork, and religious rituals. Basically, they call it the collective unconsciousness of mankind. Archetypes are things that pop up everywhere in different places. So it's something that if it's in every culture, then we have to have that it's an archetype, right? Examples include the orphaned prince or the lost chieftain's son raised ignorant of his heritage till he's discovered by his parents, or the damsel in distress rescued from a hideous monster by a handsome young man who later marries the girl. Those pop up everywhere. It's kind of ridiculous, but also fascinating. Another recurring theme is the Faustian bargain, which is a temptation motif from German folklore, where the individual sells a soul to the devil in exchange for knowledge, wealth, or power. A temptation motif itself is a motif where a protagonist's primary struggle is the conflict between his or her sense of personal honor and ethics and their own ambitions, desires, or wickedness. Like, which will win? And then we also have wish fulfillment is another popular motif that pops up, something that satisfies the reader or creator, either conscious or subconscious desires. The belle ennui. The fair unknown, a motif common to everything. Basically, the protagonist's identity remains unknown until some suitably dramatic moment. This may be the result of a child being raised as an orphan or a hero's intentional disguise. Examples of this include Luke Skywalker, who does not know his true identity. Also, remember, fairy tales are what we call didactic, which means they're intended for instruction. Some stories with a didactic tone aim to inform and instruct their listener or reader. The Boy Who Cried Wolf is a great example. What's the moral of The Boy Who Cried Wolf? Don't cry wolf, right? Because when he actually needed help, no one listened because they were like, you're just going to laugh at us, you jerk face. You guys know that story, right? Misogyny pops up a lot in folklore. It's basically the hatred of women. The Grimm brothers' versions of their German folklore falls into this category, some say, which is kind of unfair. They have a lot of strong women in their stories. They just also happen to have a lot of evil women. But I can see the argument. After you read a couple, let me know what you think. Mythopus. I think I mispronounced that. That's okay. A narrative genre in modern literature and film where a fictional mythology is created by the writer, prose, or other fiction. Right? So that's like the world of Tolkien or the world of Lewis. They've made their own mythologies. Then you have exegesis, a critical explanation or interpretation of a text, particularly religious text. And now, with all of that, you have an idea of fairy tales going forward. I will have little videos for you on every fairy tale that is available as a DBI, where I give you the Cavs Notes version of each of those fairy tales. Your options include The Frog Prince, Jack and the Beanstalk, Seven Swans, 12 Dancing Princesses, Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, East of the Sun, West of the Moon, Hansel and Gretel, Jack and the Beanstalk, Sleeping Beauty, Tamlin, and Little Mermaid. The big thing that I want you to remember to be thinking about as you're reading these is, what is each fairy tale trying to tell you about the society they're written for? How does each fairy tale react to the supernatural? Why? How does each fairy tale treat men? How does each fairy tale treat women? How is each fairy tale different depending on the place it's written, or the same? And how are the movie clips, poems, and articles related to each story? So, I also want you to remember, culture impacts a story by changing the characters and settings. There's a playlist at the top there that will bring you to a list with a clip for each movie. So whichever one you pick, scroll down, you'll be able to find the corresponding tales. I'll let you know what those videos are when I am giving you the Cavs version of a particular story. All right, so enjoy. This one's a lot of fun. I hope you have a good time. All right, stay safe, wash your hands.